So I'm going to introduce you to a word that is one of my favorite words that I didn't know until I had this friendship with our rabbi in residence in Pasadena. His name was Leonard Bierman, and he loved to use the word bricolage, bricolage, and it means the in art and literature the construction or creation from a diverse range of available things. Um, so an example would be bricolages of painted junk. Well, I hope that my PowerPoint is not painted junk tonight, but it certainly is a bricolage. Um, there was so much stuff I wanted to integrate tonight, and so I've got a lot of prompts in here about where I'm going from point to point to point. Um, but it is a representation of what's going on in my soul right now and in my heart. So here we go. Next slide. So I'm really feeling a call, as I've been saying for 3 or 4 weeks, to this business of rebuilding society on the other side of the presidential election. And I should say that along with so many people, I on Saturday morning breathed this amazing and deep sigh of relief. And and I was thrilled at all of the joy that poured out into the streets of the United States. Um, and I had done that interview with Cynthia Tucker. It was in the can. And I keep hearing Cynthia Bourgeault calling to live the laws of the next world, even now. Um, and so this is in part an old slide, but um, I think all of us are living in our hearts with this presidential election, and that we do have a president elect and a vice president elect, and we have a president who is not conceding. And on top of that, next slide, look at Georgia in this map. The whole world is focusing on Georgia. In fact, I've heard some people say it's the epicenter of political America right now. And so I want to take a look at all of the complex factors that are kind of coming in on us in our conversations about healing and wholeness and our work for healing and wholeness. Now, I don't have a slide about January 5. Everybody knows what to do about January 5. If you live in Georgia, it's a sin not to vote. For those of you who have money to send to Georgia, please send it after you make your pledge to St. Luke's Church. And I want to talk about our role as a faith community headquartered in Atlanta, with the call to wholeness, with the whole world looking at Georgia, and this vote by vote hand counting that's going on. And this is point one, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Ralph McGill in a few minutes for people who were inspired and oxygenated by his life. And I'll have a little history lesson for those of you who didn't know him. But also just to acknowledge, I'm still in point one, that so many commentators who are sensitive are saying that so much of what is going on in the White House and in Congress is about maintaining power in Congress, and doing that by making sure that the Democratic candidates for Senate are defeated. So tons of millions of dollars are going to come into our state. Lots of people are moving into the state to work, and a lot of media are moving into the state. So I think we're going to, Lala was talking earlier about feeling the relief and the oxygen that was in the air on this weekend. And I think we're also going to feel this as an environment. So that's going to be one set of slides tonight. And again, this is a bricolage. I'm just not trotting through one chapter of Richard Rohr tonight. I'm bringing a lot of different things together. I'm going to talk a little bit about a reminder about healing and domination and understanding others. Talk about the complexity of really listening to somebody when you understand that there's 7 ways of knowing, which is in the 6th chapter of our book we're studying. And also to ask the question about the matrix or the window about self, God, and the world, and end with 2 slides from Elia Delio. So I want to just go ahead and say, this is a pretty complicated PowerPoint tonight. Please stay with me. I think it's worth doing. Next slide. So I want to talk about a cultural atmosphere or climate, and how I am just staying watchful about the fact that in other parts of the country, people may be relaxing. I have to be honest. I'm not totally relaxed because of this thing that Ralph McGill pointed out. Now, Ralph McGill was a journalist and an editor, an op-ed writer, columnist, Pulitzer Prize winning thinker at the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, an Episcopalian. And he wrote an article in 1958 when the temple was bombed. And this is a quote from an article: 6 decades ago, during the civil rights era's turmoil, 50 sticks of dynamite blasted a ragged hole in Atlanta's largest synagogue. A generation later, in 1915, Jewish businessman Leo Frank was lynched during a wave of anti-Semitism, and our rector took a very public stand against that lynching. And then in the 50s, when the temple was bombed, Ralph McGill attributed the bombing to a climate of hatred. And I'll come back to there being a difference between hatred and anger. I think it's an important distinction. Next paragraph, next slide. So this really famous column written by McGill talked about the wolves of hate and the atmosphere. I don't need to read every word here. You've got a copy of this in your inbox. But Ralph McGill said, and this is the 4th point from the bottom, it is the harvest of defiance of courts and the encouragement of citizens to defy law on the part of many Southern politicians. To be sure, none said go bomb a Jewish temple or a school. But let it be understood that when leadership in high places in any degree fails to support constituted authority, it opens the gate to all those who wish to take law into their own hands. Racial hatred put everyone in danger. When the wolves of hate are loosed on one people, then no one is safe. Next slide. So what had happened was a lot of pulpits of Christian institutions were preaching and encouraging hatred for African American people in Atlanta. And his point was, you simply can't restrict hatred to one field. Now, the physicians who have done the research leading to our Mourning into Unity participation that was featured in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution this week talk about the infectious nature of violence and emotions. So I just wanted to point out this third paragraph. This too is a harvest of those so-called Christian ministers who've chosen to preach hate instead of compassion. Let them now find pious words and raise their hands in deploring the bombing of synagogue. So I'm feeling a real responsibility of us in downtown Atlanta, or preaching from downtown Atlanta, to make sure the word is a compassionate word, including compassion for people with whom we disagree. So now I get to put on the table, not in a slide, but just verbally, what really was driving this set of PowerPoint slides tonight. So some people have already commented tonight about Cynthia Tucker being my forum guest. Well, that was not universally applauded within St. Luke's. One of the things I adore, one of the millions of things I adore about St. Luke's, is that we are a big tent church. And while I understand that I just walk around secreting liberalism and progressivism and all that kind of stuff, the fact of the matter is that we also have a significant number of people who vote for Donald Trump. And my job as a proponent of big love is to make sure that I am leading the troops to talk across the aisle and to preserve the big tent nature of our wonderful faith community. And so I had a more than an hour-long conversation with somebody who does not agree with me and who feels my love and who loves me. And tonight's complexity of PowerPoint is to simply say, we have a complicated life, we who are headquartered in Georgia, and our friends, for those of you who don't live in Atlanta, who are friends of St. Luke's. So all of this is in the interest in the service of that. And I hope you enjoy it. I hope you're inspired by it. Next slide. Now, for those of you who have been with these PowerPoints for a long time, you know how much I really like the public intellectual Charles Eisenstein. When I lived in Southern California, it was Eisenstein's thinking and writing that led me to understand the importance of the myth of the separate self, and that how it drives our civilization. Thomas Merton, who was my spiritual father, said that it's delusional to imagine that we are not one. We are one. And Dr. King said that the nature of the cosmos, creation, is constructed by our being interwoven together. Thich Nhat Hanh calls it interbeing. And Charles Eisenstein, who's on this slide, has embraced the term interbeing from our Buddhist friends to offer a way of describing the new civilization that's coming into reality. In fact, Charles Eisenstein is saying that we right now are in an advanced stage of a national identity crisis. This political and ideological civil war that we are in the United States. And although Joe Biden won decisively, there's no doubt about that, with millions more votes than Donald Trump. Donald Trump did get more votes than he did in the last election, 2016. And we do have a divided country, which needs balm and bringing together. So that last sentence here on this slide, we are in an advanced stage of national identity crisis, which is the death of the myth of the separate self and the birth of the civilization of interbeing. And we are right there right now. Now, that calls for healing or whole making, to use the phrase from Elia Delio. We are called to be whole makers. Jesus was a whole maker, W-H-O-L-E. And Eisenstein, in a conversation a webinar we were having, about 100 of us on Sunday, said that healing cannot happen through domination. You're going to hear the themes of domination and competing narratives throughout this presentation tonight. He laments that both sides in our political life are in an agreement pattern, and he thinks the agreement pattern is to either be angry at one another perpetually or maybe to hate one another. Now, I'm going to preach a little bit of my sermon this coming Sunday. Most of you know that I blessedly spent a sacred 8 years in a psychiatrist's office when I was in my 30s, dealing with clinical depression. And I learned a million things from Dr. Tom Malone, a psychiatrist in Atlanta. But he told me that it was illegal for me to hate, because hatred creates war, and that brings people down. But it was very important for me to be friendly with anger, because anger, as opposed to hatred, is the insistence on being heard. Hatred, war-making, is bringing somebody down, as opposed to insisting on being heard. Eisenstein is raising concerns about how we could be in a war right now in terms of taking or bringing one another down. So he says that if you want to be an instrument of healing, if you want to be an instrument of the interbeing new civilization and new national identity, which we'll get to at the very last slide tonight, it is really important to take time to ask people who are very different, what is it like to be you? What is it like to live in your world? And so with this friend who's a member of the parish, this week, I took a long time really trying to get at those questions. What is it like to be you? And what is it like to live in your world? And I was doing that at the same time I was celebrating Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. Next slide. So those of you who have been with me this fall, I think one of the most moving moments was an evening in which we talked about a conversation between another rabbinic friend of mine, Sharon Brous in Los Angeles, and Brian Stevenson. Sorry, this is a bad picture of them side by side, but it's a screenshot. And in that, Brian Stevenson talked about how exhausting it is to be African American in this culture, and how to be Black means to be making white people of power over you comfortable. And he tells the story about a judge that came in to a courtroom where he was there to be the defense attorney, and the judge assumed that he might be the defendant or something else, but certainly not an attorney. And how much work Brian had to exert to calm this white man down and make him comfortable. And then he got into his car and just breathed a sigh of relief. And how oftentimes Black men are pulled over and a gun held to their heads by a white police officer who's living with a different narrative than the African American person who just got pulled over. And that's really why I wanted to send that link to the Van Jones testimony, witness on CNN the other night. For him to say what he said about his sons and his sister, I think is really, really important to keep as a part of our reality, while we're asking the question of someone who might disagree with us, what is it like to live in their world or to be them? Next slide. So now I want to go to Rohr's contribution to the conversation, and then end with Elia Delio's contribution to the conversation. And Richard Rohr, clearly, because of this book, is going to be calling for the wisdom pattern of order, disorder, and reorder, saying that we're in the place of reorder right now, reconstruction. And he is obviously trying to invite as many of us as possible into a practice of the contemplative mind. And Elia Delio by no means is disagreeing with that. It's just that her emphasis is on the evolutionary development or part or dynamic of the gospel. And she's going to be bringing her spiritual father, who's Teilhard de Chardin, while Richard Rohr is bringing his spiritual father, who is Francis of Assisi. Next slide. I hope I'm giving y'all enough cues at maps here. So, Richard Rohr is saying that we have to have a different mind. He calls it the mind of Christ, as does St. Paul. And he also calls it the Christ mind and also the contemplative mind. And please understand that Richard Rohr and so many of these other people who are in harmony with him are calling for a non-dual mind, which means a mind that has committed itself no longer to either or thinking, or black-white thinking, or competitive narratives thinking. So that's going to be a theme all the way through Richard Rohr's book. It is a theme, I think, of big love, which we proclaim at St. Luke's. And it is a theme that I try to commit my life to. And duality, from the graphic there, is essentially the state of separation. It's the opposite of reality, according to Thomas Merton. And it is the cause of all suffering. Duality is the product of the mind. In duality, we essentially split or divide life into right or wrong, good or bad, pretty or ugly, holy or sinful, love or hate. And Richard Rohr would say correct and incorrect, and so forth. As a result, our lives become centered around judgment, condemnation, and fear. Y'all, this graphic is a package. Whenever our mind defaults back into a dualistic way of thinking and categorizing life and people, we are buying into a package that has judgment, condemnation, and fear baked into it. Judgment, condemnation, and fear are baked into a dualistic thinking mind. Richard Rohr calls for us to understand that he thinks that Jesus, when Jesus talked about you must be born again, was talking about rebuilding your inner life so that it is love-based, not fear-based. It is oneness-based, not separateness-based. Pardon me for preaching tonight, but I really think this is so very important for our conduct of ourselves in Georgia between now and January 5. So, life is more than cerebral rational knowing, the seesawing mind that makes quick judgments, self-focused, self-interest, win-lose, either or worldview. Elaine said, rebuilding your inner life, because that's where the kingdom of heaven is. I do believe it. Amen. To a mentality and a mindset and awareness and a consciousness. Now, when I use the word consciousness, y'all, I have all these associations with that word. Remember, St. Albert Einstein said, you can never solve a problem at the level of consciousness that created that problem. If you stay stuck in the consciousness that created slavery, that created oppression to native peoples, that created misogyny, that created heteronormativity, if you stay in that consciousness, we can, as a people, not succeed in solving it. We've got to go. I'm sorry, I'm getting so strident here tonight. Y'all, excuse me. You have to go to another level of consciousness. And that, in Richard Rohr's mind, is the contemplative knowing or the contemplative mindset. It requires conversion in its most basic sense to the wisdom and vision of God. A conversion to the whole self that can embrace the whole God. Now, my spiritual father, Thomas Merton, says that's the true self, not the false self. To the degree we get triggered, divisive, have competing narratives, and want to dominate or vanquish another person, that's not our true self. That's not our God consciousness. That's our false self. So let's go to the next slide. So again, here's Brother Rohr with his spiritual father, Francis of Assisi. And last chapter, where we had the cosmic egg of meaning, where we have my story and our cultural story, or our tribe's story, and then the story, the eternal or wisdom pattern. So he's calling for a new level of self-awareness. And we're going to run through in just a second the 7 different ways of knowing. These are how you know things and how others know things. It is your window on reality or your worldview. You know, all of us in high school and college were taught the importance of discovering and naming our worldview, our zeitgeist. And our worldview or window on reality is based on who we think God is, who we think we are, and who humans are, and what the world is, and how the world works. Okay, next slide. So here's a breathtaking or breathless race through chapter 6. By the way, I think our next class is the last class before Advent. So no apologies about doing one chapter in one slide. But it's really important for us to understand that there is not just one way of knowing. And that when we're talking with our adversaries, when we're talking with our family members, when we're talking with anybody in our business, anybody in our volunteer circle, that they may know what they know from a different way of knowing than you know what you know. So let's kind of express that, articulate it. Most people think that the only way of knowing is the intellectual way of knowing. It's a Cartesian distraction. I think, therefore I am. My amness, my being, is wrapped up in my thinking. Well, that's crazy. Your amness is wrapped up in your having been created by love, by the energy of love. But nevertheless, this informational-oriented way of knowing, this rational way of knowing, what I learned in school way of knowing, is only one of 7 different ways of knowing. There's also experiential knowing, or what he calls the will. This has to do with your life choices and commitments and what they've taught you. People who have been married have learned an awful lot about life from marriage, being parents, being daughters, being sons. Those choices you've made, I've learned so much about life because I chose or was chosen to be a priest. Doctors, teachers, volunteers, all of those things give you just as important knowledge. But then there's emotional knowing. Daniel Goleman really broke through this thing of thinking that intellectual knowing was the only way of knowing when he talked about there's an emotional intelligence, and that one's EQ, emotional intelligence, is just as important as emotional quotient as one's IQ, one's intellectual quotient. In fact, he pointed out that our EQ, our emotional knowledge quotient, is actually more important in being a happy, successful person than our IQ. This pays attention to feelings as messengers and feelings as teachers. We talked a lot about that with our visions class. And then Richard Rohr on page 125 talks about how the men's work that he has been involved in has taught that men get to a level of emotional quotient that they need to function well to the degree that they can get in touch with their grief. But so many men in America are taught that it's a wuss thing to do to be sad and to cry. Well, we just saw Van Jones, and if I'd had more time in this PowerPoint, I had a beautiful picture of many times where President Obama cried in public. Likewise, for women, the women's movement, according to Rohr on page 125, found that it's very important for women to get in touch with their anger and that they can have a great insight about what they know from what has really annoyed them and made them angry. Again, my psychiatrist told me that anger comes from not feeling heard. The fourth way of knowing is from the senses. And this is the body's knowing through all of our senses. The Japanese have like 15 senses and we have 5. He talks about how Jesus touched and healed through touch. And my friend Serene Jones wrote a wonderful book about her post-traumatic stress syndrome. She discovered that she was a trauma survivor, and she went to school and also a psychiatrist to work on trauma theory. And she also enrolled in a yoga class. And she talks about in her book, Trauma and Grace, Serene Jones, about how it was through yoga that she was able to get on top of her trauma. The 5th way of knowing is through images, symbols. I love etymology, as you all know, and the word symbol comes from the prefix sim, which means together, and baline, which means to throw. So symbols are those things that are thrown toward one another. And the antonym, of course, is diabolical, which is where things are thrown apart from one another and there's no center that's holding. So a lot of us have very important knowledge from images, like the sacraments. The prayer book is very, very clear. The Episcopal prayer book, that there are a million more sacraments than the 7 essential churchy sacraments. But stories and parables, great novels, great movies. We opened by Lee talking about some documents that have coming out. Yeah, Mary Lynn is talking about, I'm thinking of all the dreams and the biblical stories. Exactly. And the Bible is essentially a book of stories. And it's not lost on me that Mary Lynn, a brilliant actor, was the one who just said that. So I love plays. And then there's an aesthetic knowing, where you have the arts and colors. And finally, epiphanic knowing, epiphanies. Sorry that the margins are obscuring that. But the eureka moments, the aha moments of great revelations. I wanted to go through all that because when you really want to talk across the divide and understand somebody, it's really important to listen for all the different ways they have come to believe what they believe. Next slide. So somebody recently told me that he or she, I've forgotten who it was. If it's one of you all, please forgive me. That pardon me, rather than competing narratives, it's really helpful to listen to somebody's story as a completion of the narratives. Because I have a story and you have a story, and my culture has a story and your culture has a story. And it's very non-dominating oriented or separate self-oriented to say the story that somebody's going to tell me now, although I may totally disagree with the values in this narrative. I mean, I run into this when I'm talking with, when I'm having a discourse with the vestiges of slaveholder Christianity, which just drives me batty. That there's a hierarchy of worth in human nature. Nevertheless, complete the narratives. And also to have different categories than our old categories. And in a minute, we're going to look at Ilia Delio and all the different new categories that she's suggesting. Anyway, it's really cool to check out the categories with which you think based on your foundational worldviews from these foundational questions. Number one, what should be? What's the grand and final vision? What are all your values in the service of promoting? Now, very good example is Jesus. He was so clear. Every chance he opened his mouth, he was talking about the kingdom of God, or as a lot of spiritual directors and the translation we use at St. Luke's, kingdom of God, i.e. that in the kingdom of God we're all kin, or the reign of love. That's a very good translation. Or as presiding bishop Michael Curry calls, when love has its way. That's what should be. The second foundational question, why are things messed up? This is what is your definition of evil and how to deal with evil. It's the churchy theological term for this is theodicy. Why do we suffer? Why are things not the way they should be? How do you deal with evil, oppression, suffering? And three, how do we get from what's broken to what should be? How do we live to make things right? Well, all of that, Richard Rohr says, is a matrix of God image, self-image, and world image. Now, I think the next slide is the last one for the night. So I'd intended to, but I ran out of time. I was going to do a slide like I had with Richard Rohr, where I have Richard Rohr and St. Francis and his cosmic egg of meaning. Well, for my sister Elia, I would have Teilhard de Chardin, Elia, and the Big Bang. Because for Elia, we have to get our cosmology right, that in the beginning was 14.8 billion years ago, and that all of us right this second have inside of us elemental atomic particles that existed in that speck that exploded 14.8 billion years ago, or 13.8. So she wrote an article about our anxious times last week. Early this week. And she says, this new president is for a new era. Life is never a closed system. It is constantly open to the future. This is our cue. We can contribute to the making of a new world order, new systems of planetary life, new ways of living with a vital religious spirituality of wholeness by trusting the power of love at the heart of our lives. This is the essential message of the gospel. So, Elia, she's just unsquelchable. She is always bubbling about how even the death of something dear is a sign that a new system is being born and there's new power of love at the heart of our lives. I think, y'all, that is what big love is all about. It understands the impermanence of life, like our Buddhist siblings have taught us, and that every moment is an invitation to a new open system. So I want us to go to our groups. Oh, one other thing. Oh, thanks. I forgot. So I won't take up any more time other than to say each of us is a vital center where Christ is being born, where the dynamic energy of the Spirit continues to draw us together into a new life. In these really electric times between now and January the 5th, we're going to have so many challenges. Please, 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 let's be conspiratorial in a community of seeing every one of these challenges. Every chance we feel the urge to call somebody an idiot, to say, I am being called to work with that person to create a new era. I may not dominate that person, I may not change that person's opinion, but that person's being is more important. And I'm going to work like hell to do what I'm called to do in terms of the political order. But I can do it with compassion and empathy and not by creating war. Holy Spirit conspiracy? Yes, Jeff Kramer, absolutely. So let's go to our small groups and ask the question, what are we being called to do right now? In terms of, and y'all, I apologize, but I didn't even get to talk about the coronavirus. We are going into the toughest phase of the coronavirus. If you listen to Brother Saint Anthony Fauci, so we've got to, have that in the mix. So let's take 6 minutes in groups of 4, please. What are you being called to do? What's the most attractive thing that you heard tonight, and what's the most unattractive thing? How about that? What do you need to work on?